So under non-standard conditions, usually the reason that something's under non-standard conditions is because the temperature has changed. Maybe the temperature is not 298 anymore. Like I said, the pressure could change, but very rarely with acid base. Or maybe the concentrations are not 1 molar of both reactants and products. So now what we have to calculate is delta G without the degree symbol. Okay, this is what I call the actual delta G. It takes into account everything. It's all knowing in terms of what reactants and products are present and what reaction is happening. So you might also hear the term instantaneous. That means you can measure this delta G at any instant. And whether it's positive or negative, that'll tell you whether a reaction is going to go forwards or backwards spontaneously. So